Power, live from Washington, D.C.
The world's two biggest economies try to hammer out a deal. Welcome to the Monday edition as teams from the U.S. and China meet in London as we speak. For the latest round, I'm Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington as we try to follow the beat on this, Kailey. It won't likely spell the end of tariffs, but the S&P 500 is floating above 6,000, just like Liberation Day never happened.
Yeah, so maybe there is some optimism about some kind of breakthrough being able to be reached at this meeting, but it might not be so much as about the levels of tariffs as it is about export controls and the export specifically from China to the U.S. of critical minerals. That really seems to be the focus of conversation, as there's been reporting that President Trump is giving some leeway to his negotiators to actually loosen up the export controls the U.S. has in place when it has been trying to restrict Chinese technological development.
I'll be curious to see how far this goes, because when we start talking about chips, we're not talking about high-tech NVIDIA chips, those that are the building blocks to AI, but apparently we have been turning the screws on some lower level technologies that China wants to get its hands on. Kevin Hassett today describing this meeting as essentially a handshake to codify what's already been agreed upon, but we'll find out from Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, who's there. Yeah,
we will in just a moment. We also are, of course, following another story, and that is the deployment of National Guard troops in California, as we've seen some, at times, violent riots taking place across Los Angeles for the last few days after ICE raids, of course, started at all. President Trump, when speaking to reporters at the White House just moments ago, Joe, suggesting that after the California governor, Gavin Newsom, who did not want the National Guard deployed, threatened or dared Tom Homan to arrest him specifically, the president says he would do it if he were Tom.
It's a pretty wild moment as the governor of California calls the borders are a tough guy. We'll see what happens as we make our way through the day.
We kick off this new week in Washington with our eyes specifically on what's happening in London. Another round of trade negotiations between the world's two largest economies, the U.S. and China, remembering that an agreement was struck in Geneva last month to lower tariffs for 90 days. But it was a little bit fuzzy as to what else was part of that agreement, specifically what China was committing to in unrestricting exports of critical minerals to the United States. President Trump got Xi Jinping on the phone last week to try to clear that up. And of course, they're working on hammering out those fine details as we speak. The principals right now at this hour, Joe, still gathered in London.
That was a perfect setup. And Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern is actually at the scene to carry the ball onto what happens next. Bloomberg's chief political correspondent outside that meeting. Annmarie, how's it going inside?
Well, they just arrived 5 hours ago, and they are still at the negotiating table. About half hour ago, we actually saw food delivery being brought in. So they plan, I think, on spending a few more hours here in London just past 6 p.m. So these talks are bleeding into the evening and potentially even till into tomorrow. What we do know from earlier, the NEC director, Kevin Hassett, talking about the fact, the contours potentially of this deal, easing some export controls that the United States has in place for semiconductors going to China. And then on the Chinese side, the U.S. wants to see more licenses when it comes to rare earths and magnets. They want to see an advanced pace that they thought they agreed upon in Geneva. The issue, of course, is what are the red lines for both of these economies? For China, it's clearly getting their hands on these advanced semiconductors, but how far is the United States willing to go? Say, are they willing to use potentially the H20 NVIDIA chips as a negotiating chip? And when it comes to China, how quickly are they really going to ramp up those rare earths? And I think what this shows you is that we are just 4 weeks out from when these two delegations met in Geneva. It just shows you how difficult trade negotiations are and reminds us all of how difficult it was for the purchasing agreement in Trump's first administration. That trade war started in 2018 and a deal wasn't in place until 2020.
Well, when we consider who is in the room today, Annmarie, obviously He Lifeng and Scott Bessent, Howard Lutnick are all there. Very high-level talks are taking place. But it was President Trump communicating directly with Xi Jinping by phone for the first time since assuming office for his second term that got our attention. Do we have any idea as to the extent to which this sets the stage for a face-to-face meeting between the two utmost leaders?
Well, that phone call definitely broke the ice. Member Secretary Bessent, after the Geneva talks a few weeks after, said that he felt like negotiations were stalling. There was a phone call, and that really led to the path to have this discussion today in London. On that phone call, though, the two leaders did discuss visiting each other. So President Xi Jinping invited President Trump and the First Lady to China, and then President Trump reciprocated as well. So potentially that could be a deliverable or something that at minimum is discussed at this meeting. Also, Kailey, it's a great point to mention that Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick is here. He was not there in Geneva. He's an addition to this meeting, and I think that just basically tells everyone that maybe we don't know how far the U.S. is willing to go, but easing of export controls is on the table.
Fascinating stuff, Annmarie. We have to be honest, though, we're still biting around the edges of a much larger potential deal here when it comes to tariffs. And I know we're looking at a deadline in August on that. Would it be a win for this to resolve to another greater meeting on tariffs, reciprocal tariffs against China?
Yeah, definitely, potentially. I think they would love to wrap this up before August, right? Because they're also dealing with a ton of other countries. The issue is, to your point, Joe, is that these are just two issues at the heart of a very bigger deal. When I spoke to the Treasury Secretary weeks ago, he had talked about how they don't want to decouple from China. There is a grand deal to be had. Of course, the issue is each country has red lines, and the other country is trying to get past those red lines. And the problem is, if you're in the United States and you care about national security concerns, there's a potential limit that you're willing to go and give to China. And then China is going to use what their leverage is, say in this instance, rare earths. So this goes beyond just trade. This has to do with national security issues as well. And to think that potentially they can get this done in August, I think is very optimistic, given the fact that what we saw just from a purchasing agreement of agricultural products by large took over a year during Trump's first administration.
All right, Bloomberg's Annmarie Hordern, our chief political correspondent, live in London on the scene for these talks. Thank you so much. And we want to get more context and analysis now as we turn to Nazak Nikakhtar here on Bloomberg TV and radio. She's National Security Practice Group Lead at Wiley Rein, also former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. Nazak, welcome back to Balance of Power. As we consider what the U.S. may be willing to give here in these talks with China taking place today, a rolling back of export controls that have been concertedly part of an effort for the U.S. to restrain China's technological development. Where do you expect the line to be drawn? Are we really about to give them access to things that can help them develop the advanced semiconductors that we have been purposefully trying to make sure they cannot do successfully?
Yeah, Kailey and Joe, great to be with you. Look, this is an incredibly complex issue, and it underscores a really important point. The fact that we have become so dependent on elements like critical minerals and the permanent magnets we need for our commercial sector, our defense sector, so much so that we actually have to give up a really important national security concerns, including dual use items. And I really want to stress the definition of dual use. Dual use items that China is seeking us to relax our export controls on are various types of AI chips, various types of chips in general, aerospace engine technology. And these are dual use because, of course, they have commercial applications, but they have enormous military applications, so much so that the government has decided to restrict them in the first place. So can you imagine this scenario where, because of our import vulnerabilities due to China's supply chains, we actually have to give up some of our critical national security concerns? The Trump administration is going to try to keep the wall up as much as they can and not give in to some of these China's demands. But the Chinese are going to double down. It's going to be tariff reduction, export control, relaxation, and then potentially something about Taiwan, as China has signaled in the past.
This is where I start to get a bit confused, Nazak. It's great to have you back. If this is, in fact, a national security concern, why is it on the bargaining table?
You know, that's really because we are dependent on some critical supply chains from China that are also impacting our national security concerns. Rare earths that you all were just talking about, permanent magnets. Again, these are things that China controls exclusively the supply chain. And in order, I think some folks in the administration believe, in order to get our defense sector up and running, the commercial sector up and running with these magnets that we need, we're going to have to give some things up. The other interesting aspect of this that makes it extraordinarily complicated is our import dependence is just goods from China. What China is seeking from us is actually the know-how and technology. That know-how and technology that I hope we don't give up to China, and we maintain our export controls, that's long lasting. Once you transfer technology to China, it's gone. But China can always turn around and stop the exports of the things that we need, the magnets, the pharmaceuticals to us at any time. And that's what I'm concerned about. Even if there's a handshake deal, even despite China's history of not adhering to deals, even if we get something, they can turn around tomorrow and block our access versus us having given up technology that now China can keep forever.
China, Nazak, one could listen to you and think that China is actually the one with all the leverage here. If they have a chokehold on this market that we need for our national security, if it's them that have the ability to just turn it on and off like a light switch, what hand does the U.S. really have?
I think the U.S., if they really want to play it strongly, they can and not give up too much. And the pharmaceutical sector, one of the sector we have the know-how to make the drugs. I don't think we're as vulnerable as some may think we are. And in terms of magnets, let's remember we have a huge magnet supply chain that's growing. We have light rare earths in California, heavy rare earths in Canada. A number of magnet producers have invested in the United States are growing. But let's also remember, we can reuse magnets. We can take magnets out of phones, out of autos, out of defense equipment, and basically remagnetize them and reuse them. And the reason I say all that is because, sure, it takes time to scale what we're building, our own domestic supply chain, but we're not at a loss. We can reuse what we currently have. And that gives us so much leverage to stay strong, to not give in to China's demands, because we're not as dependent as the Chinese like to think that we are.
Sounds like a good time to short magnets. Nazak, I wonder to what extent Jensen Huang will help to influence the outcome of this question, specifically over export controls and semiconductors. He's got the president's ear. We know they have a relationship. He's been to the White House, and he talked a lot just a couple of weeks ago about how these building blocks for AI should in fact be based on American systems, even if it's AI companies in China that are doing the work, that the American building blocks should be in place. If that's the case, we're about to see a loosening of export controls for the better, correct?
Well, we're in a situation where so many of our companies are now just developing and have been for a number of years so much revenue from China that cutting off access to that market could be pretty much short-term, in their view, catastrophic for them. At the same time, again, they're asking the U.S. government to continue the exports of dual-use items that are aiding and abetting Chinese military. Even if we, the United States, build massive data centers in China, the Chinese are using those data centers for AI capabilities that augment their military. And the way China plays is if you build it in China, you have to transfer technology to China. To me, it's a high-risk proposition that we're continuing to transfer all of our technology to China when China just doubles down, pours more money into it to indigenize it, and more people and resources. We saw what happened with DeepSeek. We saw what's happened over the last 15 years. China has accelerated its growth in technology from virtually being a really sort of developing country, not technologically advanced at all, to the technological powerhouse that it is today. And that is because we've been transferring our technology. And I think it's really time for the Trump administration to, one, take a second look as whether we want to give up more, and two, remember that we're not as dependent as some think we are.
Well, so Nazak, when we consider the time here for these very complex issues to be fully worked out, I don't know the extent to which you expect there to be firm, tangible outcomes of this meeting in Geneva, but knowing we are up against a deadline in August here of this 90-day window in which tariff levels have been brought down from the astronomical highs with which they were, is that enough time for the U.S. and China to really get into the nuances of all of this different policy, or are we just going to have to keep buying ourselves more and more extensions?
I think the likelihood that they're going to get out with, they're going to leave with a handshake deal is very likely. I think we're going to end up reducing some of our export controls, maybe on chips, chip technology, AI chip technology, the commercial aircraft engines that we've recently prohibited the exports to China. And you know what? China's basically going to say, fine, you can have more magnets. But China is probably not going to allow our military sector to have magnets for our defense and weapon systems. And, what good is a handshake deal when we have a country like China that's systematically broken deals? WTO commitments, its bilateral, cybersecurity deal in 2015, phase one deal, the Geneva deal. So yes, I think from China's perspective, it's going to give in, after a little bit of acting tough, it'll give in a little bit. It'll say, fine, I'm going to license these things to you, but we're going to reduce our export controls. And I am confident that within a month, we're going to find ourselves in a very similar situation, not getting the things we need from China. And then it's going to be a really tough call for what the administration is going to do next.
Sounds like reciprocal tariffs are not going away anytime soon.
I think that they're going to stay. And look, they were having a real dire impact on the Chinese economy when they were in the high double digits and triple digits. And I think that if the Trump administration really wanted to bring China to its knees, it could have kept the tariffs on for slightly longer. Of course, that also adversely impacted American industries. I think we're going to be doing this song and dance for many, many months ahead until one of the countries capitulates.
Nazak, great to have you back. Nazak Nikakhtar, National Security Practice Group leader. Wiley, Rein, LLP, former Assistant Secretary for Industry and Analysis at the International Trade Administration. Always a great conversation. Kailey, we'll find out maybe by the end of the day if we get a readout from either of these teams on what happened. But Annmarie says they're bringing in takeout. This may not end anytime soon.
Yeah, that's never a good sign if you're looking for something to wrap up quickly when they bring the extra nourishment in. But we'll continue to keep you updated on what's happening in London and what's happening in Los Angeles. That's where we turn to next as we consider President Trump deploying the National Guard without the say-so of California's Governor Gavin Newsom. We'll have more with our political panel next here on Bloomberg TV and radio. And we're checking on all things politics and policy for you from here in Washington. And a lot of that conversation today centers around what's happening in California, where the governor, Gavin Newsom, has threatened to sue the Trump administration after the weekend deployment of National Guard troops, a federalization of the National Guard that President Trump decided to move forward with without the permission of the state's governor. This in response to the protests that were seen getting violent over the weekend in and around Los Angeles over ICE raids. This is the first time, Joe, we have seen something like this in 60 years in the United States of America. The last time this happened was in 1965 when LBJ deployed National Guard troops in order to protect civil rights protesters in Selma.
Yeah, in a very, very different scenario.
Yeah.
Gavin Newsom writing on X, "We did not have a problem until Trump got involved." He calls it a serious breach of state sovereignty, inflaming tensions while pulling resources from where they're actually needed. Kailey, we heard from Donald Trump today as well. Yep. He made a couple of brief remarks in the driveway, but then took to Truth Social for a pretty long post here, beginning with, "We made a great decision in sending the National Guard to deal with the violent, instigated riots in California." He says if we had not done so, Los Angeles would have been completely obliterated. Remembering, of course, this was isolated to a fairly small part of town. Let's assemble our political panel to talk about the fallout here. Jeanne Zaino is with us, our Democratic analyst, Bloomberg politics contributor with the Center for the Study of the Presidency and Congress, and Republican strategist Lisa Camooso Miller, former RNC communications director and host of the Friday Reporter podcast. Lisa, is Donald Trump right? We made a great decision in sending in the National Guard to deal with this?
You know, Joe, it's inconsistent with the way Republicans have always operated, right? They've always allowed the governors to be the senior executives in their state. And ultimately, that's what it's supposed to be. That's how it's supposed to work. So the fact that he went over Gavin Newsom's head and made that decision really shows that he's played politics here. Now, there's plenty of people that have points of view about how the governor has handled these kinds of circumstances, but we've rarely ever seen, as you said, it was LBJ that did this however many years ago. And so this alone has me concerned to some degree because it is consistent with traditional Republican policy and the way that we've operated previously. And it's the other thing is that it now has Americans pitted against Americans in a time when that is the last thing we need to see happening here. And so I don't know. I think LA's got enough problems as it is. The fires were just a minute ago, and here we go again with the president stepping into state politics at a time when I don't know. To me, it just seems like a little bit, I don't know, wrong path for me in my point of view.
Well, when we consider, though, the kind of way in which this changes the administration's messaging, Jeanne, we go from talking about Trump's fallout with Elon Musk and all of the kind of social media driven frenzy around that to something that President Trump actually wants to be talking about, crime and immigration. Does this not work for him in changing the narrative? Is that not what he's trying to seize on?
Absolutely, it works for him. And that's why we've seen him all weekend truthing away about this. And of course, anybody who followed him closely on the campaign trail, he said he was going to do this. He said he will put in the National Guard. He will call them out regardless of whether he's asked. He even talked about sending in troops. So nobody should be surprised if that happens. It's not just going to happen in LA. It will be Chicago. It will be New York City. But let's not forget what undergirds this is Stephen Miller in May, his advisor, went to ICE and said, unless you get to a quota of 3,000 a day of people that you are going to deport, we will start firing people in ICE. And what that has meant is that ICE has had to go for what they describe as the low-hanging fruit. It is far easier to catch people who are law-abiding, who are going for their check-ins, who have ankle monitors on, who have alerted the government to where they are, rather than going for criminals, who are hiding, and it takes a lot more resources to catch. So one of the big questions Donald Trump needs to answer is why, after saying repeatedly they would go after criminals, isn't he doing that? And is he going after people's workers, friends, families, and neighbors? That's what set off the demonstrations in LA, and that's what's going to continue as they struggle to keep up with this quota that Miller has set.
President Trump was asked on his way out of the White House this morning, Lisa, about this idea of having the governor of California arrested. Gavin Newsom is daring Tom Homan, as we saw on cable news last night, to come and get him. He called Homan a tough guy. The president was asked, should he do it? Donald Trump, quote, I'd do it if I were Tom. I think it's great. Gavin likes the publicity. What would be the impact of a move like that?
I think it would change precedents for forever, Joe. I think that it's the kind of thing that the president seems to be happy to have these kinds of debates and these kinds of discussions and offer up these kinds of distractions. And I think your point is good. I think he wanted to get the discussion centered around immigration and crime and his toughness on those issues. And the fact that he is inciting a back and forth between himself and the biggest state in the nation is one that I think is concerning. And I think Jeannie's right. It should send a message to a lot of other big cities all across the country that they need to be mindful that this could be coming for them next.
Mm. Well, and of course, this isn't happening in a vacuum. It is also happening, to get back to the idea of the feud with Elon Musk, Jeanne, as the president is trying to get his one big, beautiful bill through Congress. And White House officials, administration officials, from the press secretary, Caroline Leavitt, to the Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, are being very quick to point out on social media today that that bill provides funding for 10,000 new ICE personnel, 5,000 new customs officers, 3,000 new Border Patrol agents. Does what we're seeing take place out in California actually make it easier for the president to make the case Republicans need to get this through quickly on those grounds?
Absolutely. I'm so happy you raised that, Kailey, because this is one of the things that the president wants to do, is to use these pictures, and they are horrendous, and Democrats and Republicans need to speak out vehemently against any use of violence. He wants to use these pictures to say this is a key reason senators and representatives on the GOP side to support this bill. He keeps talking about an insurrection. He keeps talking about a crisis, and we do indeed have an immigration crisis. We've had one for decades. And he wants to use these pictures and this insecurity to give representatives and senators a cover to tell their constituents, I know there's some things in this bill you don't like, but we had to do this because we are in a crisis. So that is absolutely what they are using. And it is a good way to turn the page from thinking about debt and deficit and all the cuts to spending and the things needed for the most needy among us, and to focus on a crisis and get this bill through.
It would be a new level to see not National Guard troops, but actual members of the U.S. Marine Corps. Lisa, Pete Hegseth, Defense Secretary, issuing a statement to say if violence continues, active duty Marines at Camp Pendleton will also be mobilized. They are on high alert. I don't know what kind of alert that actually refers to in a case like this, but apparently 500 Marines have been earmarked by the defense secretary. You don't believe he would do that, do you?
I think anything's possible, Joe. I really do. And I think that this is a time when the administration seems empowered. They feel empowered, and they feel like there's an opportunity here to set a precedent and show an example about how it is that federal force can make changes in the states. And that's something that I think Jeannie's point is right, is that Republicans and Democrats need to be mindful of that, because that's precisely, it seems like, the direction that the administration is pointing towards at this time. And it's one that I think that, as I said, it is unprecedented, and it will set the course for action in lots of other states and cities all across the country.
All right, Lisa Camooso Miller and Jeanne Zaino, our political panel here on Balance of Power on this Monday as we watch a fourth day of tensions in LA. Thank you so much. We appreciate your time. And of course, that's not the only thing we're watching in California today. As about 350 miles north of Los Angeles in Cupertino, California, another important event is taking place. The Apple Worldwide Developers Conference is underway, got going, at least the presentation of the new stuff got going earlier this hour, and shares are falling as it continues, down about 1.6% right now. So let's go out to Cupertino. That's where we find Bloomberg technology co-host Ed Ludlow, who is joining us now on Balance of Power. So Ed, what are we learning at this conference?
Well, we're learning, if you look at the stock, this is a kind of sell the news moment, right? Because what we are getting from Apple at WWDC is kind of exactly what Bloomberg's Mark Gurman reported. It centers around a redesign of the OS interface called Liquid Glass. And what Apple hopes to do with this redesign is make all of its operating systems more in line with one another, but also reflect some of the work they've done with Vision Pro, their augmented VR AR headset. Sell the news also in the fact that early in the presentation, what Apple said was that they will be talking about Siri, particularly like the consumer-facing element of Apple Intelligence, throughout the course of the year, but indicating they don't have anything of substance to say it today. And you'll be reading on the Bloomberg about how year to date, this is a stock that's down 18%, right? But it's largely traded on trade and tariff risk, not on the AI story. So there's an element of disappointment here. We didn't get more. There was some AI news though, and this is the developers conference, right? WWDC is for the developers. And what Apple said was it will allow third-party developers to build their software and their applications on top of in-device LLMs. That's a really big step when you consider the history of this company and how big a role developers have in the kind of value add of any technology company's ecosystem.
I do find it fascinating, Ed, that Apple is frequently punished for lack of, in the case of today, a big announcement about AI, but then the stock is rewarded when people start to freak out about a potential downturn in the AI spend and they see Apple as being on a safe island. But how would you describe the company's approach to AI right now?
Yeah, it's really interesting because the Bloomberg terminal can let you look back at history at periods of economic pressure or sort of volatility in marketplaces. And Apple has an entrenched market position. It has a very strong balance sheet. And quite a lot of the time, investors are sanguine about the direction of where they're going. The issue is that, you know, consumers' motivations are now driven by different things, and how they interact with AI, so to speak, is a big factor in when you decide what smartphone you're going to have or what laptop you're going to have. And the issue is you can get a very competitive offering from ChatGPT, owned by OpenAI, or Gemini, made by Google, and you can use it on your iPhone or on your MacBook. And Apple, therefore, on the services side of its business, on the software ecosystem, is getting a little bit squeezed out of its own game because of those competitive offerings. Hence, sell the news today, but they're also disappointment they didn't say more.
Always great to spend time with Ed Ludlow. Ed will be back as the headlines fly next hour on Business Week Daily with much more coming out of the Developers Conference. Bloomberg Tech co-host Ed Ludlow. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington. We're going to dig more into the legal basis for what we saw took place in L.A. over the weekend. Robert McWhirter, he's coming up next on Bloomberg. With us here on Balance of Power, live from Washington, covering politics and the latest from the White House that we've heard from the protests and the violent clashes we saw with police, and in some cases, of course, the deployment of National Guard troops by President Trump, who's saying that this was a good idea. Taking to Truth Social, we made a great decision, he writes, in sending the National Guard to deal with the violent, instigated riots in California. Of course, Gavin Newsom, the governor, sees it very differently and is threatening to sue Donald Trump for going around him as the executive of the state of California and the commander-in-chief of those National Guard troops. This is something that came up in a fascinating interview earlier today with Andrew Cuomo, former New York governor, now running for mayor of New York City. Spent some time with Bloomberg's Tom Keene and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Surveillance this morning on Bloomberg Radio. Let's listen.
This gets into President Trump's strategy, I believe. And look, first of all, on the immigration issue, he was very clear in his campaign. He believes it's an issue that works for him. During the campaign, he said he was going to deport criminals, dangerous criminals. And everybody said, yes, support dangerous criminals, of course. Now we're deporting 7-year-olds and we're disrupting families. And by the way, we're deporting people who shouldn't be deported. So that's a change. But this issue works for the president politically. The president is also very good, and I worked with the president in the first Trump administration, worked with euphemism. We had a lot of controversy, but this is a different tempo for him. Wayne Gretzky, skate to where the puck is going to be, not where it was. The Democrats have to adjust. They are skating to where the puck was. This immigration issue, in some ways, is a distraction from what Trump is really doing with cities, which is cutting the budget in a way that is so dramatic that you could really cause major difficulties for urban areas.
Governor Cuomo, pro tip. When you're going to talk a hockey, you're in a mayoral race. You pick Jean Rattel or someone like that with the New York Rangers. You don't go with Gretzky. Andrew Cuomo with us here as we look at this mayoral race. Okay, Robert Kuttner, no friend of yours, writing in American Prospect. He says, did Cuomo peak too soon? You've got the tensions of the primary. If you take the primary, the tensions of a general election with different independent candidates, and that is the present mayor in the back pocket of the president of the United States. And if we get LA, as Paul mentions, here, can you imagine this? I mean, I'll let you pick the geography, Governor Cuomo, but the present mayor of New York, can he protect the citizens of this city, given the relationship with the president after what we've seen in LA?
Short answer, no. And let's remember how extraordinary these issues, what's happening in LA. This is the exact reverse of what normally happens. Normally, it's the local government that makes the decision on how to handle an emergency and calls on the federal government. So a mayor or a governor would call on the federal government and say, I need help, please send the National Guard, or please send in additional federal help. I don't believe there's been a time where the president has sent in federal troops. You'd have to go back to like the 60s, and President Johnson and Wallace, right? That's how far you have to go back. So this is Trump being Trump. This is Trump on this issue of immigration. I'm muscled, it's law and order, these cities, these Democrats, they're filled with illegals, and I'm going to come in, and I'm going to come in hot and heavy. He started in L.A. It will happen in New York. It will happen. He knows the formula, right? It happened in New Jersey.
Is this formula to go after you? I mean, this is anticipated.
His formula is to create chaos in the cities, and he is the voice of law and order. And, you know, cities, all those Democrats, that's where all those illegal immigrants are. And he's going to come in and he's going to clean up. The flip side is, okay, create chaos in LA, create chaos in New York, create chaos in Chicago. Pretty soon, you create chaos in the nation, and that's bad for the economy.
The view from Andrew Cuomo speaking with Bloomberg's Tom Keene earlier today. There's, of course, Kailey, the legal side of this and the political side of this. We wanted to get into the legal aspect because the president is seizing on a component of the U.S. Code on Armed Services, Title 10, a provision that allows for the federal deployment of National Guard forces if there is a rebellion or danger of a rebellion against the authority of the government of the United States.
Yeah, also states the president may call into federal service members or units of the National Guard of any state in such numbers he considers necessary to repel the invasion, suppress the rebellion, or execute those laws. Of course, the governor of California, Gavin Newsom, does not agree that those conditions have been met right now, which is why he is threatening to sue this administration. But we want to get the take of a legal expert here on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. Robert McWhirter is with us. He's a constitutional lawyer, also practicing criminal defense and civil rights lawyer, founder of the law office of Robert McWhirter. Welcome back to the program, Robert. We appreciate it. As we understand that legalese, which you can interpret far better than I, did the president actually have grounds to send those troops in yesterday?
No, he did not have grounds. This is not an insurrection or anything like a true rebellion. I mean, the instance that has happened before was in 1965 when President Johnson sent in the National Guard in Alabama because Governor George Wallace made it very clear that he was going to allow the attack of civil rights, peaceful protesting civil rights workers. And it was a truly dangerous situation. That's the last time this happened, and nothing here is in comparison. In fact, the situation of the office. These are protesters.
Robert, if I could just jump in, if someone looks at the videos of what has happened in Los Angeles and sees some of these protesters, for example, throwing rocks at police officers, why would that not constitute a rebellion against an authority?
Yeah, a bunch of kids throwing rocks is not a rebellion. It is something that local police, and by their own statements, are perfectly fine handling. When protests, sadly, go bad, and certain elements do that, they have selective policing, prosecution, and they go get those kids or older adults that are committing violent acts like that, and they arrest them, allowing the peaceful protest to go forward. This has nothing to do with that. Local police were handling this situation just fine until Donald Trump put the National Guard in there. Really, the technical mechanism, the National Guard, he in a sense nationalized the National Guard using Title X, and I don't think the authority extends. And if I may, the stark and shocking hypocrisy is when January 6th, 2021 happened, which was a clear attack of violent people with arms on the Capitol, he sat on his hands and did nothing. And yet, when you have some kids protesting his immigration policy, now he sends in the National Guard. That is the shocking hypocrisy going on here.
Well, of course, Gavin Newsom, Robert, is threatening to sue, and I expect that will happen at some point here when we actually see the court documents. We'll let everybody know. The president, on the other hand, is threatening to, or at least suggesting it would be a good idea to arrest the governor of California. Tom Homan, the border czar, suggested as much. And Gavin Newsom responded in a pretty remarkable moment on cable news last evening. Listen to the governor of California on MSNBC.
He's a tough guy. Why doesn't he do that? And he knows where to find me. But you know what? Let your hands off 4-year-old girls that are trying to get educated. Let your hands off these poor people. They're just trying to live their lives, man. Trying to live their lives, paying their taxes. Been here 10 years. The fear, the horror. The hell is this guy? Come after me, arrest me. Let's just get it over with.
Come after me, arrest me, Robert. I don't know if you'd take the governor's case, but would the administration have the grounds to do it?
I would take the governor's case in a heartbeat, and I would happily do it. In fact, I'd think about taking it pro bono, although I imagine he actually could afford to pay me. But it is an important case, and he has, I think, good grounds to say that what this is a violation of state sovereignty. And in fact, it tends to be the conservative Republicans that talk about the value of state sovereignty with federal overreach. And this is a perfect example of federal overreach. And you know, I must say, too, when you compare this to 1965, there was a national consensus that had developed by 1965 that segregation and racial injustice was a national problem that President Johnson needed to intervene on. There is not a national consensus about Donald Trump's policies. In fact, Donald Trump does not have a mandate. He did not win. He is the duly elected president, but he didn't even win a majority. A majority is 51%, and he won 49.3% of the vote. So this is the key difference, I think, and this is what Gavin Newsom is basing his statement on.
Well, when we consider that the president still believes this is a winning issue for him, and he has far greater approval on issues like crime and immigration than others like the economy or his tariff policy for right now, Robert, it does raise the question of what happens if this continues to escalate, how it plays politically, but also the legal considerations around escalation. As we had the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, suggesting he would deploy active duty Marines from Camp Pendleton. Is there legal grounds for an active deployment of U.S. troops against, in some cases, U.S. citizens on U.S. soil? Can he use the same justification? Is there somewhere else that you would expect the administration to turn?
Well, the answer is no, and the specific statute is what's called the Posse Comitatus Act of 1878, which specifically says that you're not allowed to use U.S. military in a law enforcement role. And that was a statute that ended Reconstruction, and it was the southern states that wanted that statute passed. It is a wholly different thing when you have active military being proposed versus a National Guard, which technically is still under the state of California. They're the one who funds the National Guard, et cetera. Now, they are often incorporated into the national military in times of war or crisis, but that is not this. So this is a whole step of chest thumping that goes a step further, and it's all this kind of, making a big show. And by the way, the show is necessary for Donald Trump because if you actually look at his enforcement of immigration, he's failing. His numbers of deportations are way lower, about twice as low as what Joe Biden's numbers of deportations show. So there's all this energy being spent on these other things, but he's actually not doing the job that he promised the American people he would do.
Robert, there's a good chance this spreads to other cities or maybe continues in Los Angeles. God knows that these things can carry momentum. And we heard earlier Andrew Cuomo reacting to the idea of this taking place on the streets of New York or Chicago. If we're in for a summer like that, I know that we're talking about National Guard troops and the use of Marines and so forth. It's going to be the courts that finally handle this in the end, to adjudicate a finish here, correct?
Oh, absolutely. And by the way, I'll just note that the examples you just gave, I would be shocked if this ever happens in a so-called red state. Donald Trump is doing this only in the so-called blue states, although there's protests in red states that are the same going on other places. This is selective, and this is in a way to make political points and attack political enemies and attack political kind of groups that don't like Donald Trump. It is not about his enforcing immigration law. It's about him being a national reality show, and that's how he thinks he gets to stay in power and be elected.
I suspect we'll be able to talk again about this before it's over. Robert McWhirter, always a pleasure to spend some time. Robert, constitutional lawyer, practicing criminal defense, civil rights lawyer based in Maricopa County with the office of Robert McWhirter. I'm Joe Mathieu alongside Kailey Leinz in Washington, painting out of a couple of buckets here today. We've got the matter of the protests in L.A., Kailey, as well as trade talks underway today between the U.S. and China. It's happening in London, and we hope to know a lot more about this by the time we reconvene at 5 p.m. Eastern on the late edition of Balance of Power.
Yeah, as it stands right now, the principals that include the Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent, the Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, and He Feng of China are still in the room trying to hammer out an agreement on export controls and rare earths. So we'll reconvene later this afternoon with the latest. But of course, in the meantime, Bloomberg Business Week Daily is straight ahead right here on Bloomberg Television and Radio.